Good morning, this is Kathy Withers from Withers Wool. Today I'm going to talk to you about design, and it's really because, as far as I'm concerned, my gardens are dead. I have to find something else to do, and this is the time of year when I can sit down and think and kind of choose some of the ideas that I've been jotting down over the last couple months and actually putting them into practice. So the first thing I wanted to show you is the green scarf here. I actually finished that, but when I start designing, the first thing I look at is some kind of pattern. So this honeycomb one is one that has fascinated me for a while, and I chose that as a piece to work on this summer. I didn't get very far with it because I have to be mentally alert. And sometimes it's kind of hard to be that way when there's so many other things calling for my attention. So the goal was to use the black yarn with something because I have so much of it, and you know, if you want to sell yarn, you've kind of got to show how it can be used or how it can end up looking when you're doing something. So I chose a black yarn. This is between lace weight and fingering weights, closer to lace weight. This one here is a little bit thicker than the other one, but my goal was to show how some of these yarns that are variegated can end up looking when you actually knit with them. So this one right here, I used the black as my portion to go around the honeycomb, and I used the variegated color in the middle. Now the thing about using this variegated yarn is the navy is actually very close to the shade of black, so it ended up looking very abstract. When it's stretched out, you can pretty much see the difference between them, but when it's collapsed while I'm still weaving and I haven't blocked it, it looks somewhat more abstract. You can't really tell that it's a honeycomb. So if I were going to start it again, which I am not, I would pick a yarn that did not have black in it or anything close to black so that the honeycomb part would actually pop out. If you're interested in where I come up with some of my designs, I really like the German books. These are some that I've collected for years. I lived in Europe for 5.5 years, and during that time period is actually when I learned how to knit, and their patterns are really kind of cool because they're charts. And not just the fact that they're charts, but there are symbols in it. And what's nice about the symbols is that they're pretty much universal. People talk about Japanese knitting and other kinds of knittings. Well, there's nothing really all that different between the Japanese, the European styles, because they're all based on a little diagram that's multiplied out. You have to know that the little arrows here mean repeat this section to that section, and then if you want to have a complete design, then you would have to repeat, it's a portion of this part, you'd have to repeat that at the end so that they would be symmetrical on both sides. The other thing to notice is if you've ever worked with one of these patterns or haven't, you'll see all the odd number rows here. If you see the odd number rows in a pattern, it usually indicates that the back side, all the even rows are purled. So you get a stockinette background. So those are kind of interesting things. But I really love their books because they have a lot of things that, you know, we have our Stitch dictionaries, but they are not quite as comprehensive. This is a piece that I started, and I was thinking of it as a scarf, and I think I used a size 10.5 needle here. Well, it's a nice firm set of needles, I guess, for the, it gives you a nice firm, stable design. And this here is nothing but garter stitch. And I don't have a lot of other yarn to go with it. I pulled some freeform. So it kind of got sitting because it was just pretty much a sampler. At some point, I will come back to it. Then this week, I started designing a new piece. And my tendency is to start with a size 10.5 needle and then work my way down or up to get one that gives you the best drape. If you're using something with a very specific pattern in it that creates texture, if your needle is too large, you can't even tell that there's a pattern here. So I'm leaving on the table because it shows up better that way. But it starts out with 6 rows of purl, and then it has knit 3, purl 1, knit 3, purl 1, knit 3, and then, the border edges and stuff. And it's lost. It's a lot of effort to not get anything for it. So I started playing around with different needle sizes, and I shifted to a size 7 US needles. These are straight, and based on the pattern that I'm going to make, I don't happen to have any other size 7 needles, so I'm probably going to have to order some others because the design that I'm trying to create is going to be too big to fit on these really short needles. But you can see that when I went to the much smaller needles, that now you can see what I did. So I started out the exact same way. I have my border edges. Then I have knit 3. You can quite clearly see where I did the purl. Knit 3, purl, knit 3. So this is a good size needle. 9 was a little bit too much. And actually, I started with it at 10.5. This was a 9, which was clearly not going to work for what I wanted it to do, unless I were going to felt it, in which case it'd be great. But so I ended up using a size 7. And when I design, and here's where I'm going to cheat a little bit with my iPad, and hopefully it doesn't end up looking screwy, but this is how I design. I take my iPad, and first of all, I don't create a title till the end, but in this case, I did it immediately. I'm using Pages. I used to use Notes, but I found out that it's a little easier if I just go ahead and put it in Pages. I can export it as a PDF or a Word document, so that works pretty cool for me. Anyhow, what I do is I first pick out my yarn, which you probably can't see in here, and I tell you what size it is, and I give you the color that I used, but quite honestly, anything that's within that size of yarn will work for it. And the other thing that I always do is I provide notes. And my notes are really important because what they actually say is always knit the first and last stitch of every row. And in the German books, it's called a Rundemasche. It's actually an edge row. And you can see these pluses here. And those create on your piece of work a knit stitch that's really nice, that has a little, so you're knitting the front and the back on both rows, the odd and the even, you're going to end up with a little bump. And if you have to sew a garment together, those little bumps can be lined up, and it's very easy to sew it together and make sure that your rows are all lined up. So this one, right, and I include periodic, I update the photo that I have in there, and if I'm using a different book, I include written I write my own instructions because the German in this particular book did not write the instructions. They just gave you a chart. So I kind of provided both ways, explaining how I start, etc. So I actually started by casting on 17 stitches, which is actually the Runmasche, the stitches going across and ending pretty much right there, so that I could have that first design repeat, because what I'm actually trying to create in this case is a stair-step shawl. So I'm working from one end, adding the extra design each time. So as I go up, I'm adding more stitches each time. And right here you can see that I cable casted on stitches to create the next step. So I'm on, this is step 1, 2, 3, and 4. And my thought is to go out to 5 or 6 if I don't change needle size, because it'll be too hard to control the stitches if I don't, and I don't want to be dropping stitches because that's kind of not fun. And I'll work across, once I get to 6, I'll actually work across until I get halfway. I'll measure how far that was, and then I'll reverse. I'll continue the stitches and the patterns as I'm going, but I will reverse my steps to bring it back down. So that's if you're designing from side to side. Most people use a rectangular kind of pattern. I mean, not a rectangular, a triangular pattern. So they'll start with 1, 2, or 3 stitches. They'll keep adding a stitch on each end, or they'll to create a triangular shape. I've done lots of those. I kind of got tired of that pattern, so I kind of decided, what can I do that's different? So that's what I did with that one. This one right here is a piece that I started, and the reason I started it is because after washing and dyeing it, my skein kind of ended up looking like this. I'd forgotten to tie off extra portions. So I thought, well, perfect opportunity to work it, and I kind of like doing puzzles, so as I knit, I'm untangling. So this piece right here gives you an idea of what something looks like. If you're knitting a variegated yarn, you can see that it's not going to create striping. The problem is that the texture kind of really gets lost. So I'm going to finish it because it's a real small project. It's going to be a cowl. But, you know, you have to think when you're going to use these types of yarn, because unless you're using a stockinette or a garter stitch, most of the time your pattern's going to be lost. You might see some of it if it's a very light color, but to a large extent, you're not going to see it. For those of you who have American access to American books, get rid of that. This is another one that's in the series of the one I already showed you. But these I bought years and years and years ago, and I used them a lot to create designs in knitwear for my kids. And if I had known back then what I was going to be doing now, I would have kept all the things that I made. I donated them all to an orphanage when I moved from one place to another. But they were all using Red Heart, and the nice thing about the Red Heart, especially when you're using it, making something for children, is that it can go in the washing machine over and over and over again, and it's not going to fill, and it's not going to really show a lot of wear and tear. These books here, the American ones, which is kind of why I shifted away from them, is you can see that it's all words. There's no chart. And sometimes the words can be interpreted more than one way, and I find that to be extremely aggravating, because then you have to play around with it to decide. This is one of the same type, and it's really nice because it has the symbols as well as the words, and the words can be a bit much, a bit repetitive, and you have to know about the little brackets and things to know you got to repeat, etc. And then here's another one. So the only other thing I wanted to really show you was my shawls that I made, and these are some that I've done a while ago. This one right here, I started out casting on a certain number of stitches, and instead of working from end to end like I did on the other piece, this piece is worked so that every couple of inches I added a certain number of stitches on each end, and then I got to a point where I wanted to make my long tails, and that's where I added lots longer streaks in order to get my tails. I did a crochet one, exactly the same pattern, the same width and everything. The steps are not as obvious, they kind of round it out more. And then this is one of the last ones I did. It's I got patterns for all of these. I can't remember what this is. My mind's going blank. But anyhow, it started as a stair step, and same process. I just added stitches to each end on, with the idea that, you know, I could expand it out and create the tails and have a nice long shawl so that people could, if they're short like me, they can wrap it around their waist and then bring it to the front and tie it. They can flip it over the shoulder if they're nice and tall. It's very versatile. I enjoy doing it. So thank you for watching, and catch me next week. I'm hoping the weather will be nice and I might run around and do something animal-wise, but not sure. So see you next week.